There we go.
Okay.
All right, let's see. Okay, well, good evening, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona, and we are delighted to have our friend Marcia Clark back with us to talk about her brand new book, The Fall Girl. And Marcia, very kindly, as always, has signed a batch of books for us. And I don't know if you can see that, but I will go ahead and put a link in the comments field should you wish to purchase a signed copy. And I'll also be monitoring the questions and comments. So if you have questions for Marcia or Barbara, just put them in, and Barbara will summon me back on screen towards the end of the hour. Barbara, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. I love it. It's like a magical power.
We have our shtick.
We do. Anyway, such a beautiful book. I love the cover design. Talk to me a little bit, because this is Rare Bird Publishing or Press, and I don't know anything about it, Marcia.
Yeah, they're you mean the book itself?
No, I mean the publisher.
Publisher. They're a small publisher. I wanted to try something more personal, so we went with them. Really, we came to them because I initially went to recorded books, because to do the audio, they wanted me to narrate the book, and I've never done that other than the memoir, so I've never narrated any of my fiction, and I thought that'll be fun. And they said, well, why don't we just publish it also there? And so we did. So it's now in both places, and I narrated with my friend Catherine Lepard, who is a fabulous writer. She's my writing partner from way back. And I thought, she really knows how to do a line reading. She's done an awful lot of it in her time on television. So I thought it would be really fun, because the book is written in two voices. One's Charlie, one's Erica, and we alternate chapters. So I thought it would be better to have that other voice, because then you don't lose the device of two people talking.
I think that's absolutely right. Whenever you've got two different narrators, the reader has to feel comfortable moving back and forth, sort of tick-tocking between them. So great idea. I haven't listened to the audio. I can barely keep up with reading, let alone listening to anything. But my husband, because he commutes back and forth with the puppies to doggy daycare or other places, he's listened to a ton of audiobooks. So you're coming up on his list. But I wanted to say, I thought it was a really handsome book, Marcia. It's really well produced. I like the cover art, nice type size, all of that. Sometimes small press books are not as handsome as one would like, but this one's exceptionally nice.
Yeah, I was very happy with the cover. I thought it really came out well, really nice.
And you have very nice quotes from Joseph Finder and James Patterson and so forth. So even though we haven't seen you for a while, you've stayed connected to the mystery community.
Yeah. I haven't been going to events because I just, COVID. So I have been doing these kind of Zoom meetings and things, because they're fun, actually, and they're safe, which is a plus. And so I'm looking forward to, in the future, getting back to the more in-person stuff, and going back to see you in person. I miss our time together. Yeah, but for the time being, with all the variants flying around, I thought I'll just wait a little bit longer.
So if you don't come to see me, you can't share a night waiting for the flat tire people to find us on a road I couldn't describe, and take Marcia.
I remember that. That was so fun.
No, it really wasn't fun, but anyway, there we were, and Marcia was being a very good sport about not getting back to the sanctuary, and I was cursing out AAA, and the cops came by. It was all wonderful. So it taught me to really pay attention to the tire pressure gauge in the Mercedes.
Lesson learned.
It really was. I know, very strange. No, but what I actually meant was, have you been writing, or what have you been doing? Have you been writing for television?
Yeah, I was writing for television, and then I got back into casework, so that I'm doing indigent appeals, criminal cases, which I love doing that. And then I started getting into working on nonfiction, but also podcasts. And I'm in the middle of now producing a true crime podcast that will, it's with Wondery, so it's going to be a fairly big production. It'll be in a few months, I'm thinking. Depends. These things are so different than television, because you're not backing up to a definite air date. We can just kind of, we have to have it done. We can't just mess around forever, but we don't have like March 29th, it must be, it's we can take our time to put it all together, but so I'm in the middle of that too. So pretty busy. So.
Well, I can't imagine you not busy. And isn't it interesting how true crime podcasts have become such a thing?
Yeah, they're huge now. I mean, it's really, and it lends itself, it's really kind of interesting. After Serial, which was the big, with Adnan Syed, that was the big hit. And then Homecoming came along, and that was like a great scripted podcast. And so everybody kind of discovered this new world, which is really kind of funny because it's like radio, right?
It's radio.
It is radio.
It's actually radio, I know.
Yeah, but it's more, it is definitely a more immersive experience because the sound is better, and you have more effects that you can use. And even with these true crime podcasts, weaving in and out of these interviews, it's really kind of cool. And I think that Serial helped to move that along, but now it's exploded. It's all over the place.
So is it always true crime? I mean, is that the big attraction rather than fiction?
No, I think fiction's doing pretty well. I'm not as into it myself as, on a podcast. If I'm going to read fiction, I read books, but I think they're ramping up with with scripted podcasts now.
I wasn't sure what the difference. I guess an audiobook has to be completely faithful to the book, but I'm not sure how fiction. And this all reminds me when I was a child. I used to like Lights Out, and I would hide under the covers and turn on the Lux Radio Theater or, some of those really great radio programs of the 40s. And, I'm telling you that you could be far more scared listening to something than watching it.
Oh, yeah.
Your imagination, kicks in, and suspense with a creaky door and, the whole bit, you'd be terrified. So I find it fascinating that we've come back to essentially that auditory experience.
It's true. It's really true. And there's also the benefit of the mobility of it. Like your husband listens in the car.
Right.
A lot of people do that, because it's a great way to read books if you don't have time. If you're commuting a lot, you can get a lot of reading done that way, which is really cool. And of course, listen to a lot of podcasts that way. So,
absolutely. Actually, Rob has been doing podcasts from the Zoom track, and we're almost at 200,000 downloads.
Wow. That's
so
amazing.
I think we're going to have to. It's become such an expense. The cost of doing business has risen, so I think we're going to start charging like $1, which seems very modest because we've been doing it for free. But
Wow.
We'll see. I don't know how that works, but we'll investigate it. But the point is that people who don't necessarily want to sit and watch us talk on Zoom can listen to us. Come and so that's, I think, exactly what you're talking about. But let's go back to, because this is an actual book. Let's go back to The Fall Girl. So tell me about the title. Why'd you decide to call it The Fall Girl?
Well, because she's kind of the figure in the middle of it all they revolve around her, but she's not a per se speaking character. So, or only minimally, she is minimally. But the story revolves around these two women. Charlie, who had a terrible tragedy, very traumatic event happened to her in Chicago, for which she feels inordinately guilty and decides she has to leave her life behind. She was a public defender. She decides to change her complete identity, leave behind everything and her family, who no longer speaks to her anyway, and moves to Santa Cruz and joins the DA's office there. She didn't want to be in a big city where she would be noticed. She's trying to fly under the radar. She works in the DA's office in Santa Cruz and is at first really worried about her ability to do that because she was a defense attorney. That's what she loved doing. But she grooves in and she really, really likes it. She dives into the world. But she's a very damaged, very traumatized character. She's drinking, she's doing Xanax, she's doing things to deal with her demons, and she's got quite a few. And then she winds up, though, really impressing everyone. And she winds up being assigned to be second chair to a veteran prosecutor in the Santa Cruz office named Erica, who has her own demons and has done something pretty horrible that is getting her nightmares. She increasingly starts to decompensate when they are handling this big case together, because it looks like what she did is going to come back to haunt her big time and ruin her life. So she has her own problems. And then Charlie winds up trying to figure out what's going on with Erica and what did she do. And they wind up, it's a cat and mouse between the two of them. Ultimately, I'm not supposed to say ultimately, no spoilers.
Don't do that. Right. I mean, there's some serious ethics questions involved and so forth, between them. And in fact, circling around the cases. I was interested if, because it's a really dramatic, I can talk about this, really dramatic opening scene where there's like a big fire pit and Charlie, formerly a different name, is throwing everything in her life into it, torching it. But at the very end, she throws away not just her driver's license, but her whatever lets her practice, her legal identity. So I think my one question was, if she did that, how does she get to actually work in California?
Well, you can still take the bar under a different name if you have somebody who's helping you with fake ID, which is what she did.
Okay.
So she threw away her public defender's badge. She threw away her bar card. She came out here under a different name with fake ID, all set up. She took the bar, and
I missed the point where she took the bar.
I didn't talk about it. You're the only one who cares about the real stuff because you know the real stuff.
Well, the reason I do is that I can't take the bar in Arizona, because as you know, I read the law back in Virginia, and if you don't go to law school, an accredited law school, you can't take the bar exam. So I was sort of pissed that she went to California. I kind of skipped it, and I thought,
But she did go to an accredited law school. She went, in Chicago. So she has a degree that she had to morph into another name. It's like, I have a lot of that kind of detail in it. And I was told to get rid of it.
Absolutely. You're right. The only person who would care is me. And the only reason, the only reader, and the only reason I care is that it's annoyed me for 33 years, but so it goes. That's why I have a bookstore. And I have to say, ultimately, it's a lot more fun to have a bookstore. So I'm not actually complaining about it. But I did think it was interesting that she was able to reboot her life. And in order to do that, she has to have help back in Chicago. And, and so part of that help was kind of monitoring her situation in Chicago. He's a really nice guy called Brett, if I remember. And so he comes to Santa Cruz and is instrumental in what's going on. So I wish that we could really talk about the situations that both these women face, but unfortunately we can't without giving much away. But it seemed to me, Marcia, that, you must have drawn upon at least some of your own prosecutorial experience, or cases you're familiar with in order to have crafted these two problems that, everybody was having. I couldn't imagine you writing a defense attorney. Most legal thrillers are, written by defense attorneys, and it's, like their old Stanley Gardner template, or, at the last minute, there's a surprise confession in court, or tremendous evidence surface, and the defendant is always innocent. Whereas I think most of the time, in point of fact, the defendant is guilty, unless you assume that the entire law enforcement community are idiots. So I really like the way that you write from the prosecutor's side, and how passionate they are about convicting. Well, tell us about the celebrity chef. We see him up front, so it's no spoiler there.
Yeah, no spoiler there. So we begin in the beginning of the book. Erica's completing a trial in which she had her defendant was a celebrity chef, a golden boy, very handsome, very, very, very successful, and a complete asshole who terrorized women and got away with it because he was so famous and wealthy. And then ultimately got charged with the rape and murder of a girlfriend who had the nerve to leave him. And it was a very touch and go thing, because he certainly didn't look like the kind of person who would do all that he was charged with. He beat her, he raped her. It was terrible. It was a horrible, horrible crime. And it was a tough, close case. Erica wins. And then after that, another murder takes place that she gets assigned to, and that's when Charlie jumps on board. But she really suffers with that first trial of the chef, because it turns out to symbolize a number of things for her from her past life. that you find out as the book unfolds, and it triggers an awful lot for her. So she really goes the extra mile for that conviction. And so,
Right, there we are. But you raised such a good point, which is, in a jury trial, oftentimes fact does not triumph, as we know. And when you have somebody who, I mean, he's an obvious sociopath, but when you have somebody who is that, golden sort of boy, so, charismatic and, celebrity, which, well, it's in Santa Cruz, not like in Hollywood, I would
Yeah.
worry that sheer celebrity would get him off. But so the jury is confronted with this, image, this guy, and then what the crime is. And I think, you emphasize how hard it is for them to connect a guy who looks like he couldn't possibly have done anything wrong with
right.
this. And so, you worry that they're going to be desperate to find another explanation. If it's not him, then who?
Then who? Yep.
And so that's really the big burden that the prosecution has in this case, is to overcome the defendant's charm. It isn't, is that typical? Because it seems to me that most defendants aren't that charming.
Right. They're not, but it happens. And the person does not necessarily have to even be famous. If they're just handsome and they know how to behave themselves in court, and you have a heinous crime, and you actually have another possible suspect, which is what happened with Erica, with the case of the famous chef. There was the victim's boyfriend, current boyfriend, because she got rid of the chef. She left him, and now she had the boyfriend she currently had was this rock and roller who was a real kind of bad boy type, who actually had a reputation for roughing up everybody. He was equal opportunity, boys, girls, men, women, didn't matter. He was going to beat them up. So he had a bad reputation. He was somebody that the jury, when they see him on the witness stand, goes, oh yeah, now that one makes sense. But as Charlie's sitting in the courtroom watching Erica put on her closing argument, she can see the jury looking back and forth between the ugly crime scene pictures and this guy who's just handsome and looking sad. And then the crime scene pictures, and then this guy looking sad, going, they've got a better guy who looks more good for it than this chef sitting right over there. How come? And so the juries, they have questions, and it's not easy sometimes to overcome a defendant who is particularly polished and particularly smooth.
It's absolutely true. And as you and I both know, sometimes the best story wins, even in contradiction of the facts. But I did think it was interesting, again, this isn't a spoiler, that one of the things Erica tries to do desperately is to give the other potential villain here a solid alibi. So he can't be, he can't be the bad guy. And because the guy is, the way you write him, he's wonderful. The nature of this guy is he doesn't want to provide one. So I love that.
He couldn't. He was really home alone watching TV.
Right.
And so many of us are, right? I mean, that's a normal thing to happen. But when you're looking to eliminate him as a suspect, and he's just saying, hey man, I can't tell you what I was watching. I don't remember. I was watching TV. I was getting high. That's what I was doing. Yeah, I was alone. It's not a crime, right? I mean, he's an asshole, and he's not helping her, but it's because he really can't. Is he trying hard enough? She does not think he's trying hard enough. And maybe he's not, because, see above, he's an asshole, but it's true. And so she has that to deal with as well. So you have a bad guy, a seemingly looking bad guy with no alibi. And then you have this good looking chef who is up against it, and he's in the defendant's seat, and he doesn't look like the kind of guy who would do it. So it is one of those dilemmas that you can face as a prosecutor, where, a good looking defendant can be a real problem.
Well, I thought that the most recent iteration, I keep trying to move towards the light because I'm getting darker and darker. That's what I'm doing over here. Let me see if I can pull this light sort of towards me more. I thought that in the most recent iteration of the Lincoln Lawyer, there, maybe that's better. That was part of what went on, is that I don't know if you watched it. It's not the Matthew McConaughey movie, but the new series that Michael is doing. You had that kind of guy that, did he commit the murder? But he just looks like he couldn't possibly have done it. And there doesn't seem to be any concrete evidence attached that, would make it a sure deal. The thing that really pissed me off was that the actual concrete evidence is in plain view throughout almost the entire program, but nobody recognizes it. It's really brilliant television. It's only at the very end that you recognize what they've done to you. Love it. But I did like that because, again, you had a potential killer or abuser, whatever you want to call it, whom nobody really wants to believe that he could be guilty.
Yeah. Yeah.
So did you run into that in your own career? Did you have people like that?
Once.
Yes, I know. Well, sorry.
There's that.
Let's skip over him and talk about, the other people.
Not really. Usually once or twice there were, as I'm trying to remember, it's been a long time since I prosecuted, but there were defendants who were particularly charming. There were one or two, and especially one I'm thinking of who took the witness stand and was as nice as he could be and really knew how to keep it together. And I knew I had the goods on him, and it was a scary thing. I thought, oh, this could go south really easily. And it didn't. He got convicted, but he was not a violent defendant though. So that makes a difference too. I think he was, he was a check kiter back in the day when they used to kite checks. I don't even think they do that sort of thing anymore, but they're naturally a little smoother, and he was kind of a sweet talker guy. And I thought, oh boy, the jury's going to fall for this. They didn't. So that was good.
I'm sure you're right that electronic transfers and so forth, nobody uses, hardly anybody uses checks anymore or even money. So
when was the last time you saw someone write a check in a grocery store?
Very rarely, although I still write checks some of the time at the bookstore for this and that. But I've also come to the conclusion that you actually can't travel if you don't have a phone anymore. There's almost no way that you can go through all of the various things that you have to do if you're missing a phone. So there are different kinds of crimes that, have come up. So, the other thing I thought the book brought out is that defense attorneys are, if they screw up or whatever it is, what they lose is clients, or possibly they're, enough money to maintain their practice. The prosecutors are held to a different standard, aren't they, if things go badly? Because they're not working independently. They're actually salaried for, by some, because only a government institution actually can prosecute criminal matters. It's different in civil cases, but because then you just have two attorneys going back and forth. But when you're talking prosecutor and defender, you're generally, am I right? You're generally talking some kind of criminal case.
Yeah, most definitely. Prosecutors do all criminal.
Right.
And yeah, you have to uphold the law there. It's a different position for sure than being a defense attorney. Defense attorneys go in, they have to worry about their client. They take care of the client, and they have to pull out all the stops to do whatever they can. But prosecutors are there to make sure it's a fair trial. You don't just get to, we used to say, you're not just there to get notches in your belt or collect scalps, as they say. You don't get to do it that way. The whole point is to do it fairly and to give the defendant a fair trial. Observe due process, observe the law and all the rules of court. And so, you do want justice to prevail. You want someone to get convicted if he's supposed to, but you also don't even belong in court if you're a prosecutor, if you don't believe the case is there. If you don't believe you have enough evidence to prove him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So you kind of have a duty to both sides as a prosecutor.
Well, you do, but also, if you screw up, you can be fired,
Usually not. If you screw up in terms of ethics, it's like, if you
that's what I meant. Right.
Oh, yeah.
If you lose a case, that isn't what I meant. But the quandary that you're prosecuting one of the women is facing is really an ethics quandary, which could in fact lead to termination. Whereas if a defense attorney commits an ethical breach, then, they aren't necessarily fired because generally they're working for themselves anyway, although maybe in a large law firm.
They could get they could get suspended or disciplined by the bar or
Right.
fined, that kind of thing. But right, they're not going to lose their job if they screw up and they do something unethical. And often the bar doesn't even catch them. So I think that, I think you get away with an awful lot more. But yeah, a prosecutor who commits ethical violations, in theory, really should be fired. Like, for example, hiding discovery, hiding exculpatory information. That's a big, bad thing that has been done by prosecutors in the past. And they really, when that happens, I've seen it, they should be disbarred. They should definitely be sanctioned. And if it gets bad enough, they should actually maybe do jail time, because that's like, you're now endangering the criminal justice system and putting potentially an innocent person behind bars, which is a crime.
But it is, as we know, it's very hard for the legal profession to police itself, just like it's hard for the medical profession or almost any profession to really sanction its members and police them. It's all too easy to say, but for I used to marvel at some of the small things that attorneys risk losing their license over, the small amount of money that then could snowball or whatever it is. And a lot of that depended on how severely the local bar or the state bar, wherever they were, looked at it. You could do something in jurisdiction A, maybe that you could get away with in jurisdiction D, or it didn't seem like it would matter. But anyway, so I have a question for you. Have you watched or heard about this absolutely astonishing legal television drama on Netflix out of Korea called Extraordinary Attorney Woo?
No.
Well, when we're done, I want you, because you will be completely hooked. It is absolutely stunning. Everything about it is amazing, but it's also interesting to watch Korean trials. It's not really about that, it's really about this young autistic woman who graduates at the top of her class, and then nobody wants to employ her because she has autism and she's awkward, and how she deals with all that, and how the other attorneys learn to kind of, because she's actually the smartest of them in terms of, total recall and so forth. But I thought, and you would find, I think, how interesting the scene is. It's become a hugely popular thing. It's got 16 episodes and they're doing a second season.
Wow.
It's also great. It's a great tour of Korea. They end up on Jeju Island for 2 episodes. And so if you like watching, while we're all watching screens, if you like traveling by watching,
I do.
It's a great one too, but I've recommended this. Scott Turow loves it. Bob Duconi loves it. We've all talked about it. When we did Scott's book launch last week, Scott, the audience, and I all talked about Extraordinary Attorney Woo. So WOO on Netflix.
I'll remember that. Yeah,
Seriously,
I'll check it out.
You'll love it. It's just, you don't have to be in any way engaged in the legal profession to like it. I also think it's brave of them to, to have a character with that particular, I don't want to call it's even a disability. Anyway, a character with autism who's struggling, although she doesn't even, in many ways, she's not even struggling. She's just being herself.
Uh-huh.
It's so well done. Right. So
I'll check it out. I always like a good recommendation. I can always use new things. So that sounds good.
I really think you'd like it. So tell me what you're working on now. Aside from the podcast and all, are you thinking about writing another book?
Yeah. So the podcast is taking up an awful lot of time. And then we have to deal with people in a country that is far away. So we have time change to deal with, which keeps me tired a lot. And I have a caseload, and also working on a true crime book, but I don't want to talk about that one because I'm not sure it's going to turn into a book. I'm still doing the research. When it's true, you got to get it right.
Boy, for sure.
I think I'm going to go back to making stuff up, but it is really fun. And it's a new experience to write about someone else's case, so hopefully I can dig up enough to make a book out of it, because I think she's an interesting character. So
Wow, so very true. A true crime book has a higher standard, at least in, yeah, it does have a higher standard than writing a novel where you can make it all up. But if you are writing true crime, I remember years and years ago, Anne Rule came to the store. She wasn't in very
Oh,
good health towards the end of her life. And she only came twice. I think it must have been in the 90s. I don't remember how long ago she died. Um, but I've always remembered her, talking about, because her first enormous true crime success was, in fact, about the charming serial killer whose name is going out of my head, not Jeffrey Dahmer, but the guy that would
Bundy?
be like, yeah, Ted Bundy. Thank you. The guy that would be like, to some degree, your celebrity chef in the book. And she actually worked, alongside him, which made it interesting. I remember her talking about what a struggle it was to write a true account when, she was influenced by having actually known him and worked by him and been presumably, somewhat charmed by him, that then it would be very hard to, depict who he actually was. So wasn't she like the first person who really brought true crime, into kind of bestsellerdom?
I think so. She was an early one that just, I think, got the genre really rolling. Not that it wasn't around before, because we know everything's been around forever, but she was, in my mind, she was the first that really got me to think about true crime, and then there was the other genre, which is really an interesting one, which is kind of the fictionalized true crime thing. Who did Compulsion? Do you remember that? Was it Meyer Levin who wrote it, about the true Leopold and Loeb?
I do remember it. And one reason I remember it is that it was my husband's cousin was very much attached to that. He was the original, not cousin. He was like, generation or two back. He was the original intended victim, and he was ill and didn't go to school that day in Chicago. And so it's always had a kind of a, residence there. And then of course we have In Cold Blood and all the rest of it, and and that really caught people's attention, and it leads to movies and so forth. There was a very good book about the Kansas serial killer. I'm going to go back. Patrick, where are you? Are you listening to this? Because Patrick is our true crime guy, and he'll probably remember it. Which is it Charlie Starkweather? Was that the name of the guy in Kansas?
Yes. Yeah.
But there's a fairly famous book about him too. For some reason, the serial killer books are the razzle dazzle ones, that tend to get a lot of attention in true crime. And part of it may be the thrill of the hunt or something like that. But so Patrick is the one who likes to do true crime. So
I love true crime.
You should talk to me. You're doing one later this month with a reporter, aren't you? That
yeah, absolutely. There's a book about all the the journalists south of the border that have been murdered. It's a pretty intense book.
Oh, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
When's it coming?
Her name is Catherine Corcoran. I can't remember her name. I can't remember the title of the book. And she's going to do an event at the bookstore with a reporter from the Arizona Republic, Elvia Diaz. And that'll be really interesting because that's a local, a local case and so forth. But yep. Then we've done some other ones too. You've done some. Sarah Weinman, who's now the mystery critic for the New York Times, took over from Marilyn Stasio, but her preferred writing is her own genre, her own work so far has been in true crime, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. Yeah.
Yeah, she wrote about Lolita, and then she had a more recent book. I can't remember quite what it was. Patrick is the one who talked to her. And I think that's interesting that, her writing is true crime, but she is the crime critic for the New York Times Book Review. And doing an interesting job with it in a very different way than the retired Marilyn Stasio did. I mean, she does paperbacks. She does small press. She's all over the place. But, the expected, Marilyn Stasio always did the kind of expected major author, and Sarah, for the most part, does not. She's really goes after much, I don't want, fringier isn't the right word. What would you call it, Patrick? Have you actually looked at the books she's
Yeah.
reviewed?
Yeah, she's all over the place. You're right.
Yep, she
I
even
mean,
does cozies. Marilyn Stasio would have cut her throat with before she'd have reviewed a cozy and a paperback cozy on top of it. But Sarah has done at least a couple of those, and it's really, I find, very interesting. There's somebody else now called Sarah Lyle reviewing thrillers, so maybe that's sort of compensatory. And then there's a third person that does romance and all, and they tend to do columns, and they're saving their larger reviews most of the time for nonfiction or literary fiction or so forth. So this is kind of their solution to mystery coverage. I was pleased to see, I think it was the LA Times, but I might be wrong, but one of the other major papers is bringing its book section back. Is it the LA Times?
Hope so.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
I think so. It could have been the Boston Globe or something, but I'm pretty sure it was the Times. And I thought that's great because major newspapers used to have really wonderful book coverage. They would have like a section on Sundays, and even our Arizona Republic, if they never had a book section, but they had at least a couple of pages. COVID made a lot of changes, partly because nobody was doing anything live. And, they didn't want to just list videos. So we've lost that. And I'll be interested to see if we can get it back if we do more live events. Be kind of fun to see.
Oh, I'm kind of glad to see live events coming back. You know what I mean? It felt like we went through that period where there was none. And now, now it seems like people are more and more willing. And the next time something comes up, I'm going to go do it in person. Did you make it to BoucherCon? This last one?
Yep, I did. And it was lots of people there. We only stayed for a day and a half because I used it as a chance. It was in St. Paul in Minneapolis. I've always wanted to go down the Mississippi for a week. So we did BoucherCon, and then we sailed down from St. Paul to St. Louis. And
That's fun.
It was an amazing experience. I absolutely loved it. I was so happy that it was, I've done almost all the major rivers in the world. I think the only one up till now I haven't actually done is the Amazon. I've been on the Irrawaddy and the Mekong and the Nile and the Dnieper and the Danube and, the Rhine and the whole bit. And in many ways, the Mississippi was the most impressive. And one of the things that was the most impressive about it is that there are 23 locks. I think I have that right, or maybe it's 25 between Big Wing, Minnesota and St. Louis. So I was A, stunned to see the locks, and then B, we assumed that it was for flood control. But the locks are not there for flood control. The locks are there to keep a 9-foot channel open because there's a dam system was built in the 30s by the Army Corps of Engineers so that the heavy barge traffic and so forth can always go down the upper Mississippi without it running too dry. So it's not about flood control. It's all about keeping the traffic moving. And then below St. Louis, the river's so big and so wide and so deep, they don't have to bother. But I mean, we don't often spend enough time learning our own country. It's so glamorous to go abroad and, do all a cruise on the Danube or up the Seine or something. And, Mississippi was great.
Yeah, there's a lot to see here. I could stay busy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, Patrick, any questions from the audience? We've digressed to past the point of the book here by out.
Actually, I have a question. Marcia, I saw at least one of I can't remember the name of the program. It's fairly recent, but one of the cases that you kind of explored was that case on Coronado Island. Wasn't it that very bizarre case where the woman was found hanging off the balcony?
She was from here, right? Wasn't that
right.
the wealthy family from Phoenix vacationing over there?
Yeah, he was. She was with him, but that's right. They had that tie, and the Coronado house was like their summer house, and Rebecca Zahau. So that was. I'm trying to remember how I first stumbled onto that case. It was a while ago, and having seen it, I just couldn't get it out of my head. It was just an incredible case. So when I had the A&E show, that was one of the cases that I said, we've got to do this one, make an episode out of this one. And we did. And luckily at the time that we were actually shooting, someone was, Keith Greer, well, a civil attorney, was trying the lawsuit against the suspect, who was the brother of Rebecca's boyfriend. And it's a tangled tale, but it's a fantastic one, in terms of the breadth of the evidence, and very, very bizarre case, and a very incredibly tragic case. And the events all started because she was there, staying with him, with the guy who is the boyfriend, is a big, he owned Dysport, which is a form of Botox, and so was very, very wealthy. His brother was a riverboat tugboat captain down south. And anyway, she was taking care of her boyfriend's son from another marriage. And she had her younger sister there, who was 13 years old as well. And the little boy was, I think he was 5, an adorable little boy. And Rebecca had gone to take a shower or something. The little boy was playing on the upstairs balcony, and somehow, I think he had his scooter, and he fell, and he wound up going over the railing and falling to his death inside the house, falling into the foyer. And he was found there, and it was just horrifying. He went to the hospital. He lingered for quite some time, a few days. And then at the point when he passed, the brother came to stay with them. And there was a lot of finger pointing, and there was a lot of guilt feeling about, what had happened and why the boy was not being watched at that particular moment. But for those of us who know what it's like to have children, you can turn around for 1 second, and that's all it takes. So Rebecca was ultimately, the morning after, let me try and get this right. The tugboat captain, who was the brother of her boyfriend, was there in the evening. They all had dinner somewhere at the hospital with the young boy just before he passed. She was at home. Then the brother came home as well. The next morning, he claims he found her hanging nude from the balcony. Her feet were tied, her hands were tied behind her back. Question immediately becomes, how could she have done it to herself if her hands were tied behind her back, gag around her mouth, her feet were bound? How did she even get over the balcony? And so there were a number of experiments and all kinds of ways in which the police were trying to say she committed suicide, and it was all about her feeling guilty about what happened to the young boy. It was an impossibility, and we went through all of the evidence and tried to recreate, how could it possibly have happened? How could she have done that? And ultimately, I think that Keith, the lawyer, proved that she could not have done it, and most likely, and it was a civil standard, so it's not beyond a reasonable doubt, but he proved that it was more likely than not that the brother killed her and tried to make it look like a suicide.
It was such a strangely staged thing, too.
Very staged. Very staged.
I never understood the sheriff's department absolute resolution, to determine it was a suicide. I mean, it was, it just seemed to me so unreasonable, and yet they would not budge. I don't know if the coroner botched it up. I don't know why the sheriff's department was so adamant. I mean, he should have been tried, I think. And
I agree. Yeah, no, there was a lot that was hard for me to understand in terms of the way it was handled by law enforcement. And I felt like, especially after the civil trial went the way it did, and the jury didn't seem to have any trouble. Now, like I said before, it's a lower standard of proof by far. But to me, the evidence did stack up that it had to be him. That was just my opinion of what I saw. But I think at least the effort should have been made, and it seemed to me that they shut it down awfully quickly as well. But
I think so too. And, in a way, it's very it reminds me of Amy Robsart, the famous death of Amy Robsart, who really was the married but much loved woman of the man that was Queen Elizabeth I's favorite, remember? And it kept him. There was a chance that he might have married Elizabeth I, and the scandal that arose from Amy Robsart's death, falling over a balcony to her death on the floor, prevented. And lots of looking back at it, she had breast cancer. She had a very advanced case of breast cancer. And so, there's a lot of speculation that, maybe she didn't fall. Maybe she just broke, because she had, or maybe she threw herself over because the pain was so intense because there wasn't a whole lot you could do for it. But the chances that that Robert murdered her were extremely slim to none. But the scandal of it, nobody ever got to grips with it. So it reminds me very much so
Wow.
of this particular case.
Wow.
And nobody
so
will ever
interesting.
get to the truth of that one either,
Yeah. Yeah. When was that?
1570 something. After Elizabeth I, I think she came to the throne in 1558, and there was a lot of pressure on her to marry because, the Tudor dynasty was going to be out to lunch if she didn't have an heir because everybody else had died. And Robert Devereux was the, I'm trying to think, I can't remember his name exactly. Anyway, they had a long-standing affection for each other from childhood, and there was some thought that, they might marry. But then the whole Amy Robsart thing created such a scandal around. She was married to him. That was the deal. I had it wrong. Amy Robsart was married to this guy, and when she died, the suspicion was that he killed her in order to clear the deck to marry Elizabeth. But I've always thought there was absolutely no reason. She was dying anyway. So
Right.
all he had to do was wait it out.
Just wait.
Yeah. So they're just one of those things. But it's funny that a fall can be one of the most difficult things to sort out and apparently to prosecute.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you watched it. There's been now multiple iterations of the staircase with Michael Peterson, and he's the one who had actually the neighbor when he lived in Germany, the woman who lived next door, and they were very close. His couple, he and his wife, and the neighbor next door. And I think I'm trying to remember whether it was the neighbor or his wife who fell down the stairs and died. And it was supposedly an accident, but then he moved here, he married again, and it became a blended family with his sons and her daughters. And that wife fell down the stairs and died. And it was he went to trial. Do you remember this? This was a true crime thing.
It's so funny you bring it up because I was going to ask you about that case and see what your take was on it.
I thought he did it. I thought he did it.
Go for the owl defense.
The owl defense was my favorite.
Yeah.
Those murderous owls, man, they go after you. There's nothing you can do.
It's crazy.
A local person came up with this theory about how the hairs wound up from her head where they did, and it was a bizarre theory, and a lot of bizarre theories happened. But I think the bottom line is he ultimately got a deal because the prosecution it wasn't their expert, Patrick, that had it was a blood spatter expert.
It was like a clown car. I mean, when you watch the testimony, just these goofball characters. I mean, yeah.
Well, the blood spatter expert wound up coming to conclusions that he really couldn't come to by doing experiments that were not properly set up. Right. And so, the testimony was basically junk. But what was worse is that he did not tell the truth according to the show. He did not tell the truth about his resume, about the cases he worked on. So the jury was left with a false impression of his expertise, which was not fair because so much hinged on it. And I have to say, blood spatter evidence, when it's basic and it's obvious, I think it's fine. But when you start to get into a whole crime scene reconstruction thing and torture it into something that you claim it approaches DNA, that's when you're in trouble, because there's a lot of play in what certain blood patterns can mean. And it isn't necessarily only this or only that. And when you're trying to say that, and that's your linchpin, you're in trouble. Because
they had this elaborate kind of story of her like falling and like hitting her head like 4 or 5 times and crazy stuff,
coughing and then hitting her head and then sliding down and coughing and hitting her head again. And it was like, oh my God, it is a pretty tortured theory of the defense.
Absolutely.
But, yeah. So they remade it again. They had a documentary that was done by French filmmakers, and then they redid it as a scripted show with
Yeah.
Colin Firth.
Was
I think
it
it's Colin
good? Yeah,
Firth.
I've heard it's quite good.
And it was, I mean, the actors were amazing with Toni Collette.
Yeah.
She's great. And yeah, the acting was very, very good. And they made an effort to show that the documentarians were not exactly objective. I know you'll
Well,
find
I mean, didn't she fall in love with Peterson?
Yeah.
Add another great
Yeah.
wrinkle to it.
Yeah, the editor on the documentary team fell in love with
Story
Peterson.
has it all, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
can't actually make all that up,
No,
That's
it's
so
an amazing
interesting.
story.
Yeah.
It's also fascinating to me that, you'd think one wife falling down the stairs that he'd try a different technique. It's like the brides in the bath, if it worked the first time, why not just do it again? But, once could be careless, but twice appears to be intentional.
And then there's the illicit kind of forbidden love affairs that he was having.
Oh, right.
Remember that whole
Yes.
angle? Yeah.
Right. So
Well,
he
you really got into that. Wow.
Well, yeah, because it was a big part of the case, his having a whole double life with affairs with men. So there were quite a few. He had tried to say initially that it was just this one guy, and then it turns out to be no, it's quite a few guys. And so it became a part of the case because he came up with so many stories about what happened that night, what led up to that night, why did they have this big fight, and there's a lot of. So part of the, whatever the lie was, and there were quite a few, it became more and more difficult to defend him because he kept getting busted. So that was one of them.
Maybe the owl did it. We're all wrong.
The owl did it.
A giant predatory owl, for sure.
Absolutely. I'm all for it. I think we should arrest that owl.
Yeah.
I definitely
Well,
do
a
too.
question that I have, if you don't mind, Marcia, is have you considered doing a second volume of your memoir?
But to say what? I mean, the case is done. There's no news about it really.
Not about that case. No, about you and about your life.
About me. I'm boring.
She's too busy, right?
Yeah, no, I wasn't thinking about the case. I was thinking about you and your life since all of that and all the things that you've done since.
I think, yeah, I can't find myself. I can't get interested in me. No, to write a book, you have to be interested in what you're writing about. And I do not find myself at all interesting.
Channel that into your novels then, right? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think coming back to The Fall Girl, that certainly there's Marcia in this story.
Yeah.
I think it would be hard to write this book if you hadn't had prosecutorial experience. It'd be really hard to make it up from the outside.
I think it's really true. I mean, with Erica in particular, I step into the shoes of a prosecutor facing an ethical and moral dilemma, and the issues of right and wrong and the temptations that a prosecutor can face in terms of, how far do you push to get what you consider to be the right thing done. And so I like looking at the idea of a good person who does a bad thing for a good reason. So that, you'd have to be someone who at least has some experience with the criminal justice system to find that intriguing. So, or to consider that, to have that consideration about how far would you go? What would you do?
Well, I think it's more than finding it intriguing because you have to actually know how the whole system works in order to write the book. You can't just, you could posit that dilemma, but if you didn't know how the prosecutor's life works, it would wind up just being a mess. So here we are.
This is true.
Anyway, I really enjoyed The Fall Girl. I was so happy to see Marcia back because I've always been a fan of her books, and I'm looking forward to more from her. Meantime, she's going to watch Extraordinary Attorney Woo, and I am going to listen to The Fall Girl because I want to hear Marcia and her friend narrate it. Sounds wonderful. So thank you for signing copies for us. I really appreciate
My
that.
pleasure, always. Always good to see you guys. Thank you so much for having me.
It was really a pleasure. Good night. Good night, everybody. Thank
Night,
you.
everyone.